Hey guys, how you doing? This is JP Saricolia coming to you once again with another episode of Age of Heroes, my podcast. And in today's episode, I want to talk about a subject that I've been thinking for quite some time. It's one that I think has a lot of weight, and it's actually the situation or the main reason that comics haven't expanded or have grown within comics. I'm not talking about into entertainment because, of course, as these superhero stories and superhero comics particularly, they have become very popular and mainstream through the movies, through the video games, but not necessarily within comics. I think, as you know, as the world expands, in the comic world, Marvel characters, DC characters, and other Image comics, and all of them kind of expand towards a more broader view through movies and through video games. You know that comics have shrink. They have shrink down. They're smaller in size. There's less and less people reading comics than before, and there is I would say a reason that it's that this is the cause. There's a component that has been missing in comics for many, many years. And I want to talk about it. That's the reason of the title today, the missing child, the missing child component in comics. To go further into it, let's go back a bit and let's read the history. Let's go into the history of comics. Originally, comics were created with children in mind. That was the primary reason why comics were created, were developed back in the day and before the golden age of comics and through the golden age of comics and silver age of comics. Children were at the center stage of comics. That was the main reason they were created. That was the target, the audience. That was the audience that in this case the publishers were looking for, and this survived for many, many years. Now there was a change. Comics were primarily geared towards that. The stories were geared towards that. The art was geared towards that. So there was always that element. Of course, back in the day before the concept of the local comic book shop, which kind of started flourishing throughout in the 80s, but of course grew in the 90s. And that's actually where you find comics nowadays. You go to a comic book place, and that's pretty much it's a niche market only for people that are into the comics. But you hardly find comics anywhere else unless you go to Barnes and Nobles or places like that. They might have some copies. Primarily, they sell a lot of soft covers, bookstores and all that. But you cannot find them as without out of that range of the comic book shop. But back in the day, the only place to find comics was at your local newspaper stand. You go to a place where you buy newspapers. When I was a kid, that was the place that you used to buy comics. You go to the newspaper stand. You go to the gazebo where you used to sell newspapers and magazines. And of course, you go with your parents, with your dad, and your father, of course, buys his newspaper, gets his newspaper or whatever magazine he likes to read, like National Geographic or something like that. And as a child, you got the opportunity just to grab your comic book. So that was the place. So you go to the cash register with your mother, and you get a comic book from the cash register. Those are a long time ago. Remember, I was born in the late 70s, but I grew up in the 80s as a child, so I had fun memories of that. So that was the time. Of course, comics were geared towards that. You have to go to a place where children go, where there is even places that they sell ice cream or stuff like that. That's where you find your comics. You go to the little, I would say the little store in the corner where you can find them. The bodega and all those places, that's where you find the little comics. And those were fun times because that was the market. They were geared toward children. Of course, this changed slowly. Sometimes people say that was the 80s that changed that. It was the 90s that changed that. But that was before that. Even in the Bronze Age of comics, if you go back and look at the Bronze Age, there was a change in comics where a lot of comics became a bit darker in tone, more mature in content. You have to remember that the Silver Age, which actually is actually the basis for a lot of comic book readers today, or the older generation, they got older. So in the Bronze Age, there was more maturity in the content, or there was a desire to bring more mature content into comics because, of course, the readers were older. So there's a difference now. You can see that there is an age gap that is start growing as time passes by. And of course, once we got to the 80s, most of the readers are older, so mature content is needed just to keep them. So we can see that the publishers, in order to maintain business, are walking away from producing stuff for children and more into a more older audience. Of course, that gap is still increased on the 90s, which was a more older content. You know, you see more brave content, you see more stuff. Once the code of authority is out the window, of course, you see the content being more mature. You know, there's more violence, there's more nudity, there's more foul language in the comics. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. It happened little by little until it completely changed. It was during that time, of course, that there is I would say, an exodus, not maybe perhaps an exodus of younger children, not because they were running away from comics, is because comics were not as interesting anymore for their audience. As a child, I remember fondly that, you don't only have the opportunity to purchase, comics like, Marvel comics or DC comics. You also have the opportunity to get Archie comics, which I love Archie as a kid. But you also have Disney. Disney produced a lot of comics with all the different characters, which I love. I loved also the Looney Tunes. Looney Tunes also had the Hanna-Barbera characters. They also have comics, Scooby-Doo. Beyond that, you have Gasper. You have so many different comics, that kind of escape my mind right now. But there were so many different comics for smaller children, and also they were fun. They were really fun to read. And as a child, I loved to read, Gasper comics at the same time that I'm reading, Spider-Man comics. So, you see that. Of course, many of this still exists, but they're harder to find in comparison to what Marvel and DC are doing. Of course, the audience have matured. People are coming more into comics that are older, and once they're older, they want older material. So the other day I went to a comic book shop, a very small comic book shop that I normally go. I can tell you one thing, the guy's a bit of a jerk, but so be it. But I went there, and all I saw in his wall, it's just comic books of today. He has, of course, a lot of dollar bins and stuff like that, older comics, but everything that I see is just comics are geared towards an older audience. The content is more mature. I'm not against it, but I hardly saw anything that has to do with small children. And sadly, that's what's missing in comics. The lack of content. And there is. I'm not saying that there is not. But there is not enough content to really bring children into comics, to maintain, that young fan base. Yes, there are some, but they're sometimes in a corner where nobody really sees them. And to be honest with you, I don't have small kids anymore. I have a daughter; she's 18. But I remember I used to take my daughter to get some comics, and she used to love the kiddie stuff. But if I have to take my nephew who loves superhero stories, there's really nothing there for him to really read that is really worth his time, and actually that it really has a lasting impression that I would say will change his life. Because the content that we have is above his head. The content that is produced now in comics is too mature for his liking, for my liking. I don't think he should be reading some of this stuff there. And it's sad, but it's true that this is what it's happening in comics. Not only, it's not something that just happened now. It's something that has been happening years after years. For many years, it's something that we have seen. And that's what's the problem. That's what's created that the audience has been shrink and decrease. And our kids are just nowadays prefer to watch someone play Fortnite online, or play all this type of games, or go and and that's another subject for another day, the violence in video games, especially for children. But they prefer to do a lot of different things, or follow somebody on YouTube, rather than reading comics, because there's nothing interesting for them there. Because comic books have, in this case, the publishers have walked away from producing material that is interesting for them. Now, publishers have done things in order to keep younger audience, the younger audience entertained. They have revamped some series. That's the reason why they constantly revamp things, primarily because they want to touch a younger audience. However, the content still, it's totally missing for the children concept. They try to hit the market primarily with teenagers. And that's what they do, teenager stuff and older stuff, but not enough stuff for children. I remember when Disney stopped producing in the U.S. Comic books. They thought, they didn't have a market for it, and they stopped producing it. However, other parts of the world, they were still producing them, even years after the fact. You have in Mexico, they used to produce it, in Brazil, in Italy, in Europe, and a lot of places in Latin America, they're still producing, and they were doing it for many, many years, after they were actually closed here in the U.S. Because, there is a market, that there was a market still. These countries, they still have a laws, or they're trying to preserve, they have importance for children. At least they're trying to produce that. There was still a market. And I think it has to do a lot with parenting and upbringing and family values that I think we have lost as a society here in the U.S. That, our kids have matured so fast. It's easier nowadays. And it's sad, but you see it, parents allowing a child, handing them a Grand Theft Auto video game, 7 years old, rather than just a comic book that actually has more value. But the situation is that a lot of the comics nowadays don't have any value, and it's the same as playing Grand Theft Auto. So, what's more entertaining? What is more shiny for the kid? The kid likes the images rather than just reading, because, kids, let's just face it, kids don't like to read. Just some weird kids like to read, like I was a weird kid. I loved to read as a child, but most kids nowadays don't like to read, and also has to do with our education. Our system doesn't really push kids to read anymore. It's easier just to go through the iPad and the little tablets and do their stuff and solve the problems. It's more about problem solving rather than just, critical thinking. And that's something that we can talk in another time, not in this podcast, but that's the problem. And that's the element that is escaping comics. And sometimes, I wonder if they really know that. Because it seems that the publishers keep producing stuff towards the male audience primarily, and also towards a female audience, but more geared toward mature content, mature stuff, rather than creating stuff that is really engaging for kids. I'm talking about small kids. I'm talking about 5, 6, 7 years old, when they're learning to read, 8, 9, 10. Before they get into puberty, those are great ages for kids to get into comics. Once they get into comics, if they have the right material, it can really change and impact their lives for, forever. Like comics impacted my life, as a kid. I learned a lot of values, I have values from my parents, and I'm grateful. I thank God that I had a family, that nurtured me. But I know a lot of kids didn't have that. A lot of kids didn't have a father. And they needed a male figure, and sometimes Captain America became that figure. Reachers became that father figure they needed. So those were the heroes they look for, they admire. They identify themselves with the superheroes, with the X-Men, with Spider-Man, with Batman. That didn't grow up with parents. So it's such an important aspect of comics that is missing today. I don't know if this is going to change. It seems that, we live in a greedy society that is all about making money. And as long as they're making money, they're just going to keep just trying to make money as much as they can now. And right now, the mentality is just keep publishing this for the people that are here still buying the product. And let's just not care about tomorrow. And that's really short-sighted. Because if you want to have a successful business, you have to do investments towards the future. You want to invest towards the future, you want to bring more people into comics, then do it the right way. Start building towards the children. Give them material that is good for kids, and that is family friendly for them. And the parents can feel safe because their kids are reading this kind of stuff. And rather than just having stuff that actually scares the parents and and the kids are not really getting into because they don't understand, they don't identify. You have to understand, children you have to really are basic, in the way they're trained and their understanding of the world. you have to kind of cement those values that they understand. They understand the what is honesty is about. They understand telling the truth. They understand those principles are fundamental for children about respect, about honor. All those things are fundamental, and you give them those fundamentals, and children is right away. They really you pick their attention. They really care about those things. Now you try to talk about subjects of the world, about like this or that, or try to go too deep into a lot of sexual themes, or like acceptance of this or political stuff. It goes over their head. They don't understand it, and it bores them. So you need to be very basic on those fundamentals, and that's how you write for kids. And when you do it, of course, the sky is the limit. Kids love it, and that's the reason superhero stories today are so popular, because the writers of old time understood these principles. Stan Lee understood those principles, and that's the reason his creations, whether you accept that he was part of it or not, have impacted the world and changed the world, because he understood the basics, and comics understood the basics of how to reach to children. And of course, everything else is history. Yes, you know it. So what is your opinion about this? I would like to hear it. I personally think that publishers need to bring more kids into it. And that means that they need to maybe not change the content that we already have. You cannot just simply, clean the slate, but also to create more content that is just geared towards them, and push towards that, instead of just trying to please the 30, the 40-year-old, the 50-year-old person that is not going to change his mindset, and it's going to continue buying whatever he wants to buy. And, it's going to die eventually, because I'm going to die eventually. And what is the purpose of it? Am I getting, you getting enough money from me for that? I don't think so. You have to be smarter than that when it comes about business. So I would like to hear your opinion. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching this in YouTube. You can also hit the notification button so you're reminded of the next video. Please follow me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram, on Twitter. The links are below. If you're listening this through the iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker, please subscribe and download the podcast and share that podcast with your friends, so that way more people can listen to it. So and one more thing, if you're considering to supporting this channel and my podcast, you can do so through my Patreon. The link is down below. So God bless you, and I'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.
We can make a wildfire get away.